Well, it's good to have you here tonight. Of all of the books of the Bible, this one, in the book of Job, is in some ways the most confounding. I was speaking with Rabbi Feinstein today, and he and I were having a discussion about why is this book even in the Bible? What purpose does it serve? If the entire purpose of the Bible, in one way or another, was to make sense out of a crazy universe and to bring order to where there is chaos, to bring light to where there is darkness, to bring life to where there is death, why, somewhere deep in the back of the Bible, the back of the Tanakh, is this book of Eov, this book of Job? And to me, that's actually one of the most important questions to be asking. Is, as we go through our study tonight, why would the people who canonized our Bible, the people who took a series of books and decided these will be the stories that we choose to tell over and over again, would choose to include this book? And is there anything at all in this book that answers the most important questions of life, which is, in one way, why the Torah and the Bible itself was written? And finally, in all of these questions that we ask, being 70 years almost to the day of the liberation of Auschwitz, is there anything in the book of Job that is profitable for us today, living in the shadow of the Shoah, of the Holocaust? So here's a couple of things we need to say to just begin to venture into this darker place. The book of Job, you should know, the book of Job, in many ways, isn't a Jewish book. The personhood of Job, the rabbis wondered, was Job actually a Jew? Was he an Israelite? Or was he a character who was considered to be a righteous human being that existed in the Middle East, of which this is our version of his story? And there's a whole conversation about it. And in the academies today, they have found, and they do believe, that Job wasn't necessarily a Jew. That Job was an ancient parable, an ancient archetype of a righteous person faced with overwhelming sense of adversity. But we don't have that luxury necessarily of casting Job off as a Gentile or as someone who was not an Israelite, because after all, the book named after him is in our Bible. Which means that the questions we have and the questions the friends have and the questions that Job himself had are relevant and vital questions, and we're not so easily left off the hook by saying that Job isn't Jewish, that he's just another version of Gilgamesh or another Odysseus, not of our tradition, maybe bearing some truth, but not of our particular flavor of religion. Which means that the questions of God in our tradition and the questions of God in this book are our questions. And the God in this book is our God. And the characters in this book are our characters. Because the rabbis, as I said in the beginning, included this book, as difficult as it is, in our sacred canon. So what are we to do? What are we to think about 70 years after Auschwitz with a book like this, whose primary message on its surface is, we don't know God's ways, bad things happen, and yet faith is somehow something we're supposed to be expected to have? Now, I studied theology for over a decade, studied with some of the greatest Jewish theologians of my generation, or my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation, and I've read the books of those who came before us, and I can come to one conclusion about theology, the study of God, is that most of theology is, in fact, theodicy. Theodicy is a word that means the justification of God in the face of evil. That our entire way of understanding ourselves and understanding God in context of our own faith always begins from a place of saying, so, Nu, what do you do when bad things happen and people suffer? That in a modern context, all theological questions begin with theodicy. That's our task. That's the world we live in. We live in a world where theological thinking about God itself, has become at best cornered into the academy or quietly spoken about or obliquely referenced. But this book, the book of Job, isn't afraid of asking the most difficult questions, the questions of theodicy. And so we have to take tonight to unpack this book and to begin to think of what is the roadmap that's laid out for us in this book, and how I believe that this book is entirely modern. In fact, very contemporary in its understanding. And so we have to approach this book very carefully and from many directions at the same time. So the prism that I want to understand this book, the book of Job, and the story of Job, and this primary question of theodicy, of justification of God in the face of evil, and how we live after Auschwitz, the prism I actually want to use is the prism of the 4 children at the Passover Seder table. And maybe it's because I have 4 children, and I think of them, starting to think of them in this way all the time. Which one of my children happens to be the wise one today, and which one is the evil one today? I can tell you which one that one was today. Which one seems simple, and which one doesn't know enough to even ask any questions? And that baby, right? So that one, she always gets that one, right? Okay, but just tell her older brother who was climbing the sofa today, trying to jump off the staircase, which one you might think he is. So here's the prism I want to approach this book. At what point do we approach the book as a chacham? A chacham, which is the wise child. And by the wise child, I don't mean stuck in the framework of good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people, but in the framework of using our critical minds, in the framework of breaking down established structures in a critical way, but only to resynthesize them into some new understanding. And at what point do we want to approach this book as the Rasha, the wicked child or the adverse child that's willing just to break things down and not necessarily interested in putting them back together? And at which point do we approach the book as the Tam, the simple, sweet, innocent child who just wants to approach the world and let the rules of the world wash over him or her and say things are the way that they are? And finally, at what point do we approach the book as she'eno yodea lishol, one who doesn't even have the tools to engage in the conversation, one who doesn't even have the tools to engage in a theological conversation? I know Passover is several months away, but trust me, I'm already starting to clean my house and trying to get my stuff in order. But I think to approach this book, if you take those 4 understandings and those 4 approaches to our religion as found at the Seder table, we might be able to develop a multifaceted understanding and see how the book of Job is actually still really, really important for us today. So let's talk about the book. Let's begin with the prologue. So if you've got your sheets, okay, I've taken little glimmerings of each of the sections of the book, and I've condensed them down into like 4 pages. It's a much longer book. It's 40-something chapters, so you'll forgive me if I skip over your favorite parts. Okay, so if I could say once upon a time, I would say once upon a time. So in the prologue, once upon a time, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was blameless and upright and one who feared God and turned away from evil. So Job, we're seeing, right? What is the Bible already telling us about Job? Job was blameless. He was good, right? He loved or he feared God, right? He turned away from evil. And guess what? This Job, he was blessed with 7 sons and 3 daughters. His possessions were 7,000 sheep and 3,000 camels and 500 yoke of oxen and 500 female asses and very great household, so that this man was the greatest of all men of the East. He was in the 1%, right? Okay? And his sons used to go and hold a feast in the house of each one on his day, and they used to send and call for their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. Now, did he get his wealth because he cheated or stole? Did he have many children because he philandered? No, it seems to say that he feared God, he did what was right, and he achieved everything that a human being would want to achieve in one's lifetime. It's the American dream, right? It's the sense of if he worked hard, he lived by his work ethic and by his God ethic, and God blessed him. So, in a sense, it's setting us up, right? This is the straw man of the argument. Because the theology you have to put in your mind now is the one that comes in the 2nd paragraph of the Shema, which says, if you follow me and you follow my commandments, I will bring you rain in its appropriate season, and you will eat and you will drink, and you'll be happy, and you'll be rich, and you'll be successful. And so in this very opening gambit, the book of Job tells us this man named Job was rich, and he was powerful and influential, and had a big family, and they all got along because they invited each other to every simcha that there was, and nobody seemed to argue with each other, and it was a full house, right? So we already know that this is a work of fiction, right? Okay. So, and then when the days of the feast would come and to their end, Job would send and sanctify them. And he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, it may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. And thus did Job continuously. So even after all the feasting and all the partying and all the gladness and joy, when the party was over, Job would go out to the field and he would sacrifice sheep and bulls to God, because just in case there was a single bit of jealousy, a single bit of sin, even inside, Job wanted to erase it, so he made doubly and triply sure by bringing these sacrifices. So this is the opening, and we find that Job seems to be, right, perfect, right? Everything about him is perfect and shiny and beautiful, right? He's married to Barbie, right? He's got the big house. He's got lots of mishpacha around him, lots of family around him. Everything is so great. And by the way, after they leave the beach house for the weekend, he goes and he gives tzedakah and he goes to Minyan in the morning because he wants to make sure that everything is right this way as much as it feels right this way with his family. So that's Job. What a great guy. Then there's this next section, which is, to me, the most inscrutable part of the entire book. So if I was filming this movie, there would be all these wonderful things happening, and then this camera would begin to pull away, right? And you'd go up to heaven, and then you'd have this conversation. So now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. And the Lord said to Satan, "Where are you coming from?" And then Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro in the earth and from walking up and down in it." So here is like just another day in people's court, in God's court, right? And Satan shows up, and God said to Satan, "Well, where have you been?" And as if God didn't know, right? And Satan says, "I've been all over the world." And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? That there is none like him on earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and turns away from evil." And then Satan answered the Lord and says, "Well, does Job fear God for nothing? Have not you made a hedge around him and around his house and around all that he is ever on every side? You've blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions are increased in the land. But put forth your hand now and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has now is in your power. Only upon himself don't put forth your hand." And so Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord. So what's this conversation? Yeah. So someone said they have a bet, right? I wouldn't actually say it's a wager, right? Because it's more of a trial, right? A bet would be like going to Vegas and figuring out who's going to win the Super Bowl, right? This is a wager or a trial, a proving ground of how great Job actually is, right? It's more of a trial or a test, almost like the 22nd chapter of Genesis of Abraham and his faith, right? Which many of the rabbis make a parallel between Abraham and the binding of Isaac and this story of Job because of this. In fact, in that story, they interpolate Satan into the story of the Akedah at one point to make it more similar to this. Now, before we go too deep into this section, I put it in italics, if you can tell, for a reason. Because this section of Job was written by a different author, according to scholars. This whole section. The section of Satan and the conversation between Satan and God about making the wager or the test of Job. So here's where we have to take two minds at the same time. What if you were to take this one paragraph out of the whole book? What if you were to take the paragraph about Satan out of the book? Then the entire reason why these bad things happen to Job becomes unclear, becomes almost more human in the experience. God's motivation for allowing this terrible thing to happen becomes unclear. So I want you to keep that in your mind, this little wager piece. Keep that off to the side and start thinking about this book without that section and see how it fundamentally changes the entire reading of the book. Okay? Okay, so fast forward a little bit of time. There was a day when his sons and his daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house. So now, if I was filming the movie, there'd be a commercial break, right? And then you come back, and now there would be the next scene. And they're eating and drinking. They're back in the Malibu Barbie house, right? Everyone's happy. And then a messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the asses were feeding beside them. And then the Sabaeans came upon them and took them away. They've slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. So here, the first thing that happens is all the flocks and the servants were murdered and taken away. And while he was still speaking, another also came and said, the fire of God has fallen from the sky and has burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. And I alone have escaped to tell you. And while he was still speaking, another also came and said, the Chaldeans made out with 3 bands and fell upon the camels and carried them away and slain the servants with the edge of the sword. And I alone have escaped to tell you. I mean, this, to me, you can either read this as extremely serious or almost comic. Right? Literally, you're sitting there and you're about to put some food in your mouth and this servant comes in and you're like, oh, that's terrible. And you're about to take a drink of water or something and then someone else comes in and then you're about to do something else and someone else comes in and next thing you know, everything has been all thrown up in the air. Because while he was still speaking, another came and said, your sons and your daughters were eating and drinking wine in their elder brother's house. And behold, there came a great wind from the wilderness and struck the four corners of the house, and it fell upon the young man, and they are dead. And I alone have escaped to tell you. So here's the first question I ask, right? What were the things that happened to Job and Job's possessions? And right, they were all destroyed, right? One after the other, and if you took a literary view of this, you would see it goes from the least important to the most important. It goes from the external to the internal, from the things he has the least relationships with to the thing he has the most relationship with, right? So then Job arose, tore his robe, and shaved his head, and fell down upon the ground and prostrated himself, and said, naked came out of my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In Hebrew, it's really beautiful. It says, Adonai Natan, Adonai Lakach, Yehi Shem Adonai Mevarach. In all this, Job did not sin, and nor did he lay a reproach on God. Okay. Terrible things happened to Job. This is just the setup. We haven't even begun the actual story yet. In one chapter, all of these things happen. That was just to get us out of the way to now get to the point of the whole book, right? Now let's get into the discussion of the book, which has to do with why did all of these things happen to Job? And in some ways, that little paragraph about Satan and the bet, right? It ruins the book. You see, if you take that little paragraph out, suddenly the conversations that we're about to have now make sense and now have substance to them. Because each one of the friends that comes to try to comfort Job tries to give a reason why bad things happen to good people. But the only way you can understand that is if you take the conversation between Satan and God out of the book for a minute. Because it just gives away the whole story. We could have just finished that and say, you know what? I know why bad things happen to good people. Because Satan had a bet with God, and that's the end of it. This is what leads scholars to think that the whole conversation with the bet was added later as a theological commentary or gloss on the book itself. So take that out for a minute, and now let's ask the question. Why do bad things happen to good people? Why would God allow this blameless person, if we understand theology, to say God is supposed to help people who are uprighteous and people who try hard and have good families? Why would God allow all these terrible things to happen? Each one of the friends has a different answer. And to give away the end of the book, none of them are good answers. Just like today, when we try to answer this question, none of them are good answers. So the first friend who comes, his name is Eliphaz. Eliphaz is a Temani, he's from Yemen. And he comes and he answered Job's sorrow, and he says, I love this. I love how they talk to each other because it seems so nice and is really so dastardly. Okay? So here he says, if you look on page 2, he says, if one would venture a word to you, would you be offended? Have you ever had this situation? Excuse me, do you mind if I give you some constructive feedback? Right? Would you be offended if I tell you how you're utterly ridiculous and wrong? Right? It's like trying to be polite, but you know everything that's going to come after that sentence is going to be, pretty nasty. So this is what he says. He says, would you be offended? Yet, who can restrain himself from speaking? Behold, you have instructed many, and you have strengthened the weak hands. Your words have upheld him who was falling, and you have strengthened the feeble knees. But now it has come upon you, and you faint. It touches you, and you are troubled. Is not your fear of God your confidence, and your hope that the uprightness of your ways? So here's what he's trying to say, right? You, Job, who've had everything in life, your life looks like honeysuckle, compared to mine. And now it's coming back upon you, and you look like you're so sad. I don't really have much sympathy for you. Now you look faint and troubled, right? So how do you read the next sentence? Is not your fear of God your confidence? Right? This could have been Satan himself speaking if you play with that level of understanding, right? Where's your faith in God, rich boy, right? Remember, I beg of you, he says, moving on, whoever perished being blameless, or where the righteous were cut off. As I have seen, those who plow iniquity and sow wickedness reap the same. By the blast of God they perish, and by the blast of his anger they are consumed. Eliphaz is saying what? You, Job, must have done something wrong. There is something about you that you deserve what you've gotten. You were so rich and so powerful, and now you are so low and so feeble. There's a reason for that. Just admit it. And then he goes on to twist the knife in the wound even more. And he says, behold, happy is the man whom God corrects. Therefore, do not despise the chastening of the Almighty, for he makes sore but binds up. He wounds, but his hands make whole. He shall save you from 6 troubles, and in 7 no evil shall touch you. In famine he shall redeem you from death, and in war the power of the sword. You shall be hidden from the scourge of the tongue, nor shall you fear destruction when it comes. At destruction and famine you shall laugh, and shall not be afraid of the beasts of the earth. For you shall be in league with the stones of the field, and the beasts of the field shall be at peace with you. And you shall know that your tent is at peace, and you shall visit your habitation, and you shall miss nothing. You shall know that your seed shall be great, and your offspring like the grass of the earth. That sounds interesting, right? That harkens back to some Genesis language. And you shall come to your grave with a rich harvest, like a full sheaf of grain which comes up in its season. Behold this, we have searched it, so it is. Hear it and know it for good for you. So first thing he says, right, when he twists that barb, he says, you know what, you should be happy with all this terribleness that's happening in your life. Right? Because maybe you deserved it. Oh, and by the way, when you're happy, it could always be worse. It could always be worse. How many of you have ever had a trouble in your life and someone said that to you? It could always be worse, right? It could always be worse. And so when it does get worse, you'll be okay. You come from good stock. You've got good connections, you know? Oh, and by the way, to make you feel better, you'll probably die rich. Because what happened today doesn't really matter. You're going to end up being great. So what's Eliphaz's whole... First of all, he's a jerk. Let's be clear about that, right? But second of all, what is his whole understanding of why bad things happen to good people? It's because he understands, or his understanding is, good things happen to good people, and bad things happen to bad people. And when bad things happen to good people, it's because the good people actually deserved it. And by the way, that's a good thing, because what it does is it shows God's power in the world, and it shows that those people who deserve bad things are going to get what they deserve. Okay. Well, this is why I haven't gotten to Job's response. This is just Eliphaz's understanding, right? So let's very quickly, in one sentence, tell me why that is wrong. I'll tell you one reason why that was wrong. The first funeral I ever did was for a 16-year-old boy named Nathan Pitkin. He was a 16-year-old who was looking at colleges in Ithaca, New York with his grandfather, and his rental car that his grandfather was driving on one of those roads near the gorges was slammed by an 18-wheeler, and they went off the cliff into the gorge. Nathan was a great young boy. I only met him once because I was still an intern in Alexandria, Virginia. And I had just come home the night he died, or the night he found out he died. I just came home from working in my internship, and my wife, we hadn't had any kids yet, when we were staying with a host family, and they made a great dinner. I had a glass of wine. It was like poached salmon. I was like, this is a great internship. I get to drink every night. It's amazing. And I get a call from the rabbi that I was interning with telling me to be outside in 5 minutes. Someone died. We have to go. And so I quickly get dressed again. And the host mom who was hosting us that summer came out, and my rabbi that I was interning with drove up and opened the window to his car, and all he said out the window to the mom was, "It's Nathan." And I jumped in the car, and in the rearview mirror, I saw the host mom basically collapse on the front lawn, and my wife was holding her. I didn't know who this boy was, but we knew it was someone young. 20 minutes later, we arrived at the house and found Mom on the kitchen floor and silent. And we spent the 4 hours on the kitchen floor with her, not trying to make any sense about why Nathan died, but just trying to be there. And so when you look at someone like Eliphaz and you say, well, you know, Nathan, this really great kid, and his grandfather, there must have been something either wrong with the mom, her dad, or her son that would result in something terrible like this. It's just not true, right? It doesn't comport with our experience, and it certainly doesn't give us any comfort. Job says the same thing. He basically dispatches Eliphaz, we'll see in a couple minutes, very quickly. Don't give me good things happen to good people, and when bad things happen, it's because I deserved it. That is not our understanding of what God is and what it means to have faith. So here comes the next friend. His name is Bildad. Now, Bildad and Eliphaz, they have similar arguments, but Bildad's is even harsher. He says, if thy children have sinned against him, and he hath delivered them into the hand of their transgression. By the way, middle of page 2. If thou wert pure and upright, surely how he would awake for thee, and make the habitation of thy righteousness prosperous. So what is he saying? It's not you, Job, who deserves this punishment. It's your kids. Your kids sinned. We got to remember, we go back to the beginning. Even if the kids had sinned, what did Job do at the end of every one of his parties? He'd get up in the morning and do all sorts of ritual things to say, you know what, let's just make sure, maybe we shouldn't have had that extra whiskey last night, so maybe we should just make sure we should go and give tzedakah, right? Maybe it's the kid's transgression. And then he takes the argument and twists it. He says, can a rush grow up without mire? Can reed grass grow without water? While it is yet in his greenness and not cut down, it withers before any other herb. So are the paths of all who forget God, and the hypocrite's hope shall perish. His hope shall be cut off, and his trust shall be a spider's web. He shall lean on his house, but it shall not stand. He shall hold it fast, but it shall not endure. He is green before the sun, and his branch shoots forth over his garden wall. His roots are wrapped around the stone heap. He selects for himself a place of stones. If he is destroyed from his place, then it shall deny him, saying, I have not seen you. Behold, this is the joy of his way, and from the earth others shall spring. You know what? It is good that this bad thing happened to you because it gives you character. Right? You needed some pruning. Your silver was a little tarnished. You needed it to be drossed. You needed to be proved up. For what is a grass that hasn't been cut or a tree that hasn't been pruned? And by the way, you should be happy about this because what makes you stronger is better for you. How many of you have ever experienced this when someone has asked you when you've experienced something terrible? You know, whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. This is Bildad, right? And then he goes on and says, don't worry, the good things are going to happen to you in the end anyway. Is this our version of what we want to take as profitable? That those who perished blameless in the ovens of Europe made us stronger as Jews? Is that the argument that we make for the state of Israel? That the state of Israel only grew out of the ashes of Auschwitz? And without Auschwitz, we wouldn't have Israel? That's Bildad's argument. We're stronger as a Jewish nation because through the fires of Auschwitz, we became tempered. And we learned that we needed to carry guns and missiles. That might be an interesting argument for Zionism. But it's not an interesting argument or a profitable argument for a diaspora Jew who's trying to figure out why my kid got sick, right? Now, I'll tell you, this argument, Bildad's argument, is very similar to an argument that Emil Fackenheim made after Auschwitz. His argument was, don't give Hitler a posthumous victory. So the reason why you need to be Jewish is to live out the understanding of never forget. To live for Judaism, right, in the shadow of the Holocaust is to differentiate yourself because of this experience. Now, I can tell you that's how I grew up. I grew up with this argument. I grew up with two really important things. I grew up with a yellow Yortzeit candle that we would light on Yom HaShoah and a blue and white tin pushke that we would give money for the building of the State of Israel through the JNF. Those were sacred objects in my house. And they motivated generations of Jews. This is Bildad's argument. But I also have to tell you today, when I speak with young Jews, many of whom don't feel so close either to the State of Israel or even to Jewish institutions like synagogues, they don't buy this argument anymore. They don't buy the argument that to be Jewish, you have to live in the polarity between the Shoah and Medinat Yisrael. They want something more constructive, living not inside this tragedy, but contextualizing it and putting it in a different place as part of my greater Jewish experience, of which we still need a narrative that makes sense. So we have to move on and keep thinking about now, which one of the sons are we talking about? Tearing things down, putting them together, not understanding, letting the rules of the world just sort of wash over you, or in many cases, not even having the facility of language to have the conversation at all. Keep all of these things in our mind. Okay, let's go to the third friend. That's on page 4. Don't worry, Job is going to get his day in court. Right now, we're just listening to the friends, okay? His name is Zophar, and it's interesting. He's a Naamatite. Now, who was Naamah? Naamah was, according to legend, the wife of Noach. Okay? And so she was the one who kept the peace on the ark the whole time, according to the rabbis. And so far is they connect her to him as trying to figure out how to make peace with all of these moving parts. And listen, because he's not so much of a jerk as the first two. And he just tries to have a simple understanding, one that we try all the time and end up being confronted by often. So let's take a look. Chapter 11, which is now on page 4. So far the Naamite said, should not the multitude of words be answered? And should a man full of talk be justified? Should your babble make men hold their peace? And when you mock, shall no man make you ashamed? For you have said, my doctrine is pure, and I am clean in your eyes. But oh, that God would speak and open his lips against you, and that he would tell you the secrets of wisdom. For wisdom is manifold. Know therefore that God exacts from you less than your iniquity deserves. Can you find out the deep things of God? Can you find out the purpose of the Almighty? It is high as the sky. What can you do? Deeper than Sheol. What can you know? Its measure is longer than the earth and broader than the sea. If he passes through or shuts up or calls to judgment, then who can hinder him? For he knows vain men, and when he sees wickedness, shall he then take no notice of it? For the stupid man shall become wise when a wild ass's colt is born a man. And if you prepare your heart and stretch out your hands towards him, if iniquity is in your hand, put it far away, and let not wickedness dwell in your tents. Surely then shall you lift your face without blemish, and you shall be steadfast and shall not fear. Because you shall forget your misery and remember it like waters that pass away. And your eye shall be clearer than noonday, its darkness shall be like the morning, and you shall be secure because there is hope. And you shall look around you, and you shall take your rest in safety. Also you shall lie down, and no one shall make you afraid, and many shall entreat your favor. But the eyes of the wicked shall fail, and they shall not escape, and their hope shall turn to despair. Supersede these rules and become vital and powerful, because we create the rules, not God. We can't understand those rules. Those rules are out there. And so why do bad things happen to good people? Because the weak let it happen to them. Because who's strong, what's might makes right. And in this world of chaos, the only thing you got is your fist and your wealth. Because you can't understand God's morality. It's too far. It's too dark. It's too deep. So what's Sofar's understanding? It's the nihilistic understanding. It's not even the atheistic understanding or the humanist understanding. It's deeper than that. You've got nothing to live for, so you might as well just live. You've got nothing to strive for, so you might as well just fight for the things that you can get in this world and be done with it. And for some people, that's really, really, really empowering. But for someone who's like emotionally empathic, it's kind of hard to hear, right? It's like saying, if you have troubles, so at first glance, it seems like, okay, someone tells you something bad happens, and someone tells you, we just don't understand God's purpose in the world. Okay, maybe. And in fact, that plays out in a different way in the book we'll see in a minute. But where it so far twists and turns is he says, that's when you'll find your greatest joy. Because you've got no companion. You've got no compass. And so just seize the day. And all you have is your faith. And your faith is irrational, and it's either going to be in God or it's going to be in yourself, and you choose. So that's another understanding of why bad things happen to good people, is because they just do. And that's not a bad understanding. But where it gets darker is what do you do with that? How do you live in the world? What choices do you make? Do you set a boundary and an orderliness in the world? Or do you do what we have done in the secular age and cast off any sense of transcendence and live in this age without an idea of something beyond ourselves? We need to look around ourselves and find that maybe that's the culture of the world that we actually live in now, where there are no frameworks anymore. There are no justifications for why things happen. They just happen. And we make those justifications up afterwards. And that we live in a culture that is secularized not just in public life, but in the mind, inside. And that secularization has empowered many and brought many people who felt that a religious understanding of the world was somehow backwards or foreign, lets them express themselves. But it's also when you unmoor and untie all the things that bound us together, we have to ask the ultimate question, what's really beneficial about being together? What's beneficial about living together? And this is a deep question for us today. Because in this generation, this fourth generation, this fifth generation American Jew that isn't living with direct experience of the Holocaust or the establishment or existential threat to the state of Israel. And that's all they've learned. They've put those yellow Yortzeit candles away, and they haven't taken out those blue and white pushkas. Then they're left with someone like Sofar who says, I don't know what the constructive narrative is anymore. And things become ultimately broken. Should we let Job have his day? Let's keep going. Job finally gets a chance to talk. He says, now we're middle of page 4. He says, behold, my eyes has seen all this, and my ear has heard, and I understood it. What you know, I know also, and I'm not inferior to you. He's telling all these so-called friends to back off. Surely I would speak to the Almighty, and I desire to reason with God. Of course I want to know from God why all this is happening. But you are forgers of lies. You are physicians of no value. Oh, that you would keep silent, it should be your wisdom. It's better that you don't say anything at all than try to come up with these things for me. Hear now my reasoning and listen to the pleading of my lips. Will you speak wickedly for God and talk deceitfully for him? Will you show him partiality? Will you dispute for God? Is it good that he should search you out? Or as one man deceives another, will you deceive him? He will surely reprove you if you secretly show partiality. Shall not his majesty make you afraid and his dread fall upon you? Your remembrances are like ashes, and your bodies are like bodies of clay. Hold your peace, let me alone, that I may speak, and let come on me what will. For what? I will take my flesh in my teeth and put my life in my hand. He's saying basically, nothing you have said has said anything about God, or have questioned God, or have had any empathy for my suffering. You've come up with all reasons to take me down, to tear me down. Let me do that myself. Back off. And this is what he says. This is really interesting, because you can read the next sentence in a number of different ways. He says, though he slay me, yet I will trust in him, but I will maintain my own ways before him. This shall be my salvation, for a hypocrite shall not come before him. Hear diligently my speech, and let my declaration be in your ears. Behold now, I have ordered my cause, and I know that I shall be justified. What's he saying? Even though God has harmed me severely, he slay me, right? I will trust in him. So this will give you step 1. Reading number 1 is what Hegel believes and Christian theologians believe. Despite all of this, I have irrational faith in God. I trust in God. I love God because I trust things will work out. That's an answer that we hear a lot, right? Bad things happen, and all you have to do is have faith. That's and for Christians who understand faith in Christ and Christ's love and grace, and a God who so loved the world that God would send God's only Son down to be born upon the cross. That's a Christian way of understanding, and it's not our way, but it's a way. Our way is different, and our way comes in the next few sentences. He says, whether you read this as a but or an and, it still makes sense. I will maintain my own ways before him. This shall be my salvation, for a hypocrite shall not come before him. Hear diligently my speech, and let my declaration be in your ears. Behold, now I have ordered my cause, and I know that I shall be justified. In addition to maybe irrational faith or trust in God comes an ordering of the world that I do in partnership. Despite terribleness, despite the darkness, I will live with veracity, and I will live with compassion, and I will live with justice and truth, despite it. Despite it. And that's not a matter of faith, although it could be. It's a matter of integrity, finding the part inside myself that is most connected to goodness, and saying, it doesn't matter how bad things get. The only thing I have right now is myself. I don't have any stuff. I don't have a house. I don't have a wife. I don't have children. I don't have any money. All I have is myself. We echo this every Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur in the prayer of the Untitled Chapter. All these things happen. We pass before God, who will live and who will die. And the only place to start rebuilding your life at the turning of the year is with your own body and your own soul. We start that work on Rosh Hashanah, and it becomes crystal clear on Yom Kippur, where we use a ritual of purifying our bodies through our fasting and a ritual of purifying our souls through meditation, prayer, and acts of good deeds and learning. The place to do that is just with yourself. Not because we have an irrational faith in God, but because the only thing we have to bring into the world when everything's been stripped away is our integrity, inside and out. And Yom Kippur is the holiday that we use to straighten out that which is crooked, to reestablish that covenant with ourselves, and to say, all I have is this, and this is where I begin. So Job's answer, major answer, is I begin with myself. Now go to page 5 at the top, because we're running a little short on time. He does, though, reserve the right to question God. And here is a very famous line from the book of Job. Will you break a leaf driven to and fro? And will you pursue the dry stubble? For you write bitter things against me, and you make me inherit the iniquities of my youth. You put my feet also in the stocks, and look narrowly to all my paths. You set your print on it the heels of my feet, and he is consumed like a rotten thing, like a garment eaten by moths. He doesn't let God off the hook. He yells at God. He tells God all the terrible things that had happened. He said, I haven't done anything wrong. I don't think I've done anything wrong. So why am I in this position? I don't care what the friends think. This is between me and you. And finally, deep into the book, chapter 38, God finally shows up again. And by the way, if you take the whole Satan-God piece out of the beginning, God hasn't shown up at all until now. And then the Lord answered Job from the whirlwind, the tornado, the storm, and said, who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up now your loins like a man, for I will demand of you, and you will answer me. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if you have understanding. Who determined its measures, do you know? Or who has stretched the line upon it? Upon what are its foundations fastened? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and the sons of God shouted for joy? Or who shut up the sea with doors when it broke forth, and it had issued from the womb? And when I had made the cloud its garment, and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed bounds for it, and set bars on its doors, and said, thus far shall you come, but no further, and here shall you proud waves be stayed. Have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know his place, that it might take hold of the ends of the earth, and the wicked might be shaken out of it? It is changed like clay under the seal, and they stand like a garment. And from the wicked their light is withheld, and the uplifted arms shall be broken. Have you entered into the springs of the sea, or have walked in the recesses of its depths? Have the gates of death been opened to you? Or have you seen the doors of deepest darkness? Have you comprehended the expanse of the earth? Declare it if you know it all. Stop right there for a minute. Okay, so God is basically saying to Job, Where were you when I turned the light on and started up the universe? Were you there when I set the tide schedules? Were you there when I put those amino acids together to form life for the first time? And where will you be when the sun runs out of gas? Where will you be when the earth freezes over? Have you seen that yet? Have you approached the doors of death and have passed through them? The first move that God makes out of the whirlwind is to say, you know, Job, the world and all the things in it, it's just not about you. It's just not about you. The world is crazy and complex. There are things called tectonic plates, and there are things called cells. And when tectonic plates rub against each other, when finite things bump into each other, things happen. And if you happen to be in the wrong place when that happens, you're going to be affected by that. And when your cells bump into each other and certain proteins turn on and certain bad things start happening inside your body, it's because in a finite world, nothing is perfect. In a finite world, it's the price you pay for having a body is that sometimes it will break. And that's not your fault. But it's not about you. Nothing you did caused that. Nothing you did caused the earthquake or the storm. And when things bump into each other, sometimes they're destructive and sometimes they're constructive because you can't create life without things bumping into each other. But the world at its heart is not about you. It is a world that you are a part of, but not the center. And he goes on, and he goes on, and he goes on. And God eventually talks about, have you seen the crazy braying of the crazy donkeys up in the hills? Have you seen the wildebeests in Africa? Have you seen all these amazing things that you've never seen? And Job's reply, which is now on page 6, because I want to get to some larger questions. And Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do everything, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this who hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me which I did not know. Here I beseech of you, and I will speak. I will demand of you and declare you to me. I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eyes see you, and therefore I loathe myself and repent in dust and ashes. Job shuts down. Completely shuts down. He says, you know, God, I asked you to show up and tell me what's what. You told me what's what, and now I have nothing to say. Where do you go from here? How many of you have been in situations where you get to an end of a conversation and you're not sure what to do next? We've had like a meaningful conversation, and now you're like, well, I just guess there's nothing left to be said right now. It's the moment that Job is experiencing. So now let's take the view out for a minute. Take that camera and just pan it way out. And take a look at this book as a whole. And go back to some of our original questions. Job is silenced by God, which is a dangerous thing. Because when the conversation stops, when we stop sharing with each other, stop questioning each other, stop loving each other, that's when relationships stop. I think God kind of made a mistake here, right? Because then now Job is left with nothing to say. And so the question that's set before our community in this light is a very similar question. If we raised our kids to relive the Holocaust in their eyes and to fight for the state of Israel, when the Holocaust recedes into memory and into history, and there are no longer anyone to give us direct experiences, We never taught our kids how to love and love our Judaism without referencing that. They become just like Job. There's nothing left to say. There's nothing Jewish to live for, only to live despite. That's the challenge that's set before us, and the challenge I've taken up and tried to dedicate my rabbinate to. And I think the answer to that question lies in God's answer. It's actually the answer to all of our questions. Why is this book in the Bible? Why do I think bad things happen to good people? How do we understand God in the shadow of Auschwitz? And how do we dispel of all of those theologies that just don't work by all those friends? It's right there in God's words. God might begin by saying, where were you when this, that, and the other happened? But the writers who wrote that, the people who put that together and chose that as the God's major revelation to Job, chose their words really carefully. Because what God does out of the whirlwind is show Job the beauty and the majesty and the expanse of the universe and the wildness of life and the greatness of vitality and living. Knowing that each one of us might not experience it all, but that we are part of it, and that it is part of us. And that while the world might not be about me, I am certainly part of the world. And what God shows Job is that life itself has transcendent value. I'm the God that cares about this. And while terrible things might happen, this is a book about life. This is a book about the greatness of life and the vitality of life. And that's how I talk to some of the young people. When I ask them, is the Torah really about life? Is the Bible really about your life? And they bring this question up. Why do bad things happen to good people? And the answer is that they just do. But what God wants from us is what God told Job, to be part of this greater tapestry and to take appreciation of meaning in the turning of the seasons and as the sun rises and the sun sets, and choose to see meaning in that. Because the miracle of this book is that God still chose to reveal God's self to Job. There could have been no disclosure. There could have been only questions without any answers. But even if the answer came in a storm and in a whirlwind, it was an answer nonetheless. To say, we are still in relationship. And it might not be, I can't tell you the reasons why it happened, because God never says to Job, oh, by the way, I had this bet with Satan. We took a poll, right? And if you take that part about Satan out of the book, then God never discloses what happens to Job and why it happens to Job. All he says is life can be hard. And the answer to the harshness of life is to live life, is to seize the vitality, to put the yoke around Orion, or to tie Orion's belt, as God says, and to put the yoke over the Pleiades, and to ride the stars in your life. And the closest thing we have from this is to understand that from death, you can go back to life again. That when things are really bad, you can come back. For we know that's what happens in the epilogue. Job remarries. He has kids. He finds his way again, and he returns to life. He is resurrected in this moment, not in a metaphysical sense, but in a very real sense. He returns to life again. So now, why was this book included in the Bible? because this book proves the veracity of the Bible itself. You can look at this book and you can look at Job's life and say it's very human. And that what makes this right is that Job chooses to order his life according to the ethics and the morality and the beauty found in the other dozens of books in the Bible. And that without this as a frame, the Bible itself makes, in some ways, less sense, because then the Bible doesn't speak to the everyday experience of a human being. They say when you take a gray box and surround it with a black box, the gray box looks brighter. And if you take that same gray box and surround it with a white box, that gray box looks darker. It's the same gray box. The book of Job is that outer black box that makes the inner box, the gray box, brighter. For it shows us the better truths found in the Torah and in the prophets and in the writings. And so I just want to conclude by thinking about tonight being the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz and how we make that box brighter again, living in its shadow. 70 years after the destruction of the first temple, the king of Persia, his name was Cyrus, allowed us to go home. 70 years after the destruction of the second temple, the academies of Sura and Pumbedita and the academies at Caesarea, Tiberia, and Yavna were firmly established, and rabbinic Judaism began to flourish. 70 years after the Shoah, we have a beautiful state, and we have an amazing diaspora community that is more powerful and more wealthy than Jews have been in its entire history. 70 years after the Shoah, we have done our work, and there is much more yet to be done, but we no longer need to live to despite the fires of Auschwitz. It's now time to grab a hold of the next big project of the Jewish people, to live for constructive, beautiful, loving Judaism. And that's one of the things we learn right out of here, out of the book of Job.